In present-day Israel, there is a place whose ancient name was Armageddon. It has witnessed combat since the beginning of time. The Bible's book of Revelation prophesied that Armageddon would be the scene of a final apocalyptic conflict. The Battle of Megiddo, the modern name for Armageddon, took place in September 1918 and represented the final World War I clash between the Turkish and British empires in Palestine. On one side was the Turkish army, which included German detachments. On the other was the British-Egyptian Expeditionary Force. It included troops from Australia, New Zealand, and India. Arab guerrillas led by the legendary T.E. Lawrence were also fighting on the British side. Megiddo was the last battle where the use of horse cavalry played a decisive role. The battle also demonstrated the devastating potential of warfare's newest medium, air power. However, the end result would mainly be determined by a dramatic clash between the confident British general Sir Edmund Allenby and the German defense expert General Lehmann von Sanders. At their height, the sultans of the Turkish Ottoman Empire had ruled the Balkans, North Africa, and much of the Middle East. But by 1914, Turkey had lost most of the Balkans, and the empire was reduced to just the Middle East. Although Turkey's power was waning, its strategic location still threatened the two major powers in the region: Russia through its lifeline to the Mediterranean, and Britain through its vital link via the Suez Canal to India and the Far East. In the years before the war, German Kaiser Wilhelm had courted Turkey with such success that it joined the German side in October 1914. The initial British strategy in the Middle East aimed to secure links with Russia through the Dardanelles, occupy Basra in present-day Iraq, and then secure the Mesopotamian oil fields, all while defending Egypt. The Dardanelles campaign in 1915 was a bloody failure for the Allies, as was the British advance in Mesopotamia. In January 1915, the Turks tried to cross the Suez Canal and invade Egypt, but the British fought them off. In the spring of 1916, the British were finally strong enough to remove the Turkish threat to the canal. The plan was to advance through Sinai and capture Gaza. The offensive opened in April 1916, but progress across the trackless desert was slow. Not until the following year did the British reach Gaza. Their two attempts to dislodge the Turks failed. A stalemate ensued. The time had come for a new commander. In June 1917, General Sir Edmund Allenby was sent to lead the Egyptian Expeditionary Force. 8 months later, the Turkish authorities also decided that their forces in Palestine needed new direction and appointed a new commander, a German officer with experience of serving with the Turks. General Otto Lehmann von Sanders arrived early in 1918, determined to alter Turkey's fortunes. General Sir Edmund Allenby, and General Lehman von Sanders could each draw on a lifetime of soldiering. Edmund Allenby, the son of an English country gentleman, was born into a privileged family in 1861. He was commissioned into a crack cavalry regiment at the age of 20. Unlike many of his fellow cavalrymen, he attended the Army Staff College, where he took his profession seriously. Like most leading British commanders in World War I, Edmund Allenby made his reputation in South Africa, fighting against the Boers. He led a cavalry squadron with great distinction. By the end of the war in 1902, he established his leadership abilities. At the beginning of World War I, Allenby was commanding a cavalry division in France. By mid-1915, he was leading the British Third Army on the Western Front. However, the British Commander-in-Chief, Sir Douglas Haig, was critical of Allenby's performance during the Somme offensive in 1916 and at Arras in early 1917. He decided that Allenby would be better suited to the Middle East. Allenby was tall, physically tough, and stamped his authority on his subordinates. Born in 1855, General Otto Lehman von Sanders was of Jewish ancestry and the son of a successful businessman. The Kaiser ennobled him with the title von in 1913. He adopted the name Sanders from his Scottish wife, Amelia. With the Kaiser's influence, von Sanders was appointed to lead the German military mission to Turkey in December 1913. But General Hans von Seeckt, who became Chief of Staff of the Turkish Army, sneered at Sanders' bourgeois background and questioned his credentials as a soldier. Von Seeckt's attitude and that of other Prussian aristocrats would cause von Sanders serious difficulties. Von Sanders' first challenge was to rebuild the Turkish army, which was poorly trained and had little modern weaponry. He started by appointing German military advisors at the lower levels of command, and with determination, he achieved miracles and improved the Turkish soldiers' confidence. He then took charge of the Turkish forces facing the Allied landings at Gallipoli in the Dardanelles. Lehman von Sanders' own tactical ability and the performance of the reformed Turkish army frustrated the British and forced them to evacuate Gallipoli in January 1916. Von Sanders took over as commander of the Turkish-German forces in Palestine in February 1918. He soon realized that a new British offensive was inevitable. He was determined to frustrate it, as he had destroyed the British attacks at Gallipoli. Von Sanders and Allenby now prepared for what they knew would be the decisive battle in Palestine. In June 1917, Allenby arrived in Egypt, resolved to develop a strategy that would defeat Turkey. First, he took steps to improve the supply lines across the Sinai Desert by building a railway. He then attacked the Turkish defenses at Gaza. Allenby captured the town on November 7th. He pressed on to Jerusalem. On December 9th, the campaign ended in triumph when Allenby and his soldiers entered the Holy City. Allenby became a national hero, fulfilling British Prime Minister Lloyd George's wish to have Jerusalem as a fitting Christmas present to the British nation. Lloyd George urged him to strike again and deliver a decisive blow to persuade Turkey to surrender. Allenby disagreed, doubting that Turkey would give in without a German collapse on the Western Front. He also needed to extend his supply lines to support a fresh offensive. Nevertheless, Allenby mounted limited attacks in March and April 1918. His targets were Turkish communication centers in Palestine. But Allenby was then forced to rush 60,000 troops to France after the Germans launched a series of major offensives on the Western Front in March 1918. This frustrated his plans for further attacks in Palestine. Allenby had to await reinforcements before he could prepare for a decisive offensive to evict the Turks and their German ally. He planned a battle of annihilation on the plains of the ancient battlefield of Megiddo, north of Jerusalem. Allenby knew that now he outnumbered von Sander's Turkish and German forces in both men and guns. Furthermore, the length of the front revealed that von Sander's defenses lacked depth. In addition, much of the ground behind the Turkish defenses was open, flat countryside, which suited the cavalry. Allenby had three options for his main attack. First, there was the right hook, which would attempt to force open the road to Damascus. Second, there was the body blow, or frontal assault, which would rely on overwhelming superiority. Finally, he could use the left hook, cutting through the more difficult coastal plain. Allenby chose to maneuver with his right and then use his cavalry to punch decisively with his left. Allenby had once successfully used his right hook during the offensive against Gaza in 1917. Now he intended to make von Sanders believe that he would do the same at Megiddo. With an elaborate deception plan, he would move the bulk of his cavalry west. This would then break through the Turkish defense line along the coast, while he simultaneously pulverized the Turkish defenses elsewhere with an awesome artillery bombardment. The Desert Mounted Corps would then be responsible for swinging in to the right to destroy the remainder of the Turkish forces aimed at Allenby. To carry out this ambitious plan, Allenby had 57,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 520 guns, supported by the bombers and fighters of his air force. Allenby had another trump card up his sleeve: the Arabs. In June 1916, the disaffected tribes of Arabia had risen against their Turkish masters. The British had been quick to take advantage of this and sent a number of advisors to help and encourage them. Foremost amongst these was Captain T.E. Lawrence. He had formed a close relationship with the Arab leader Prince Faisal. Lawrence and Faisal began by raiding the vital Turkish supply line to Arabia, the Hejaz Railway. This tied down many Turkish troops who could have been used against the British in Palestine. The Arabs then began to drive the Turks out of Arabia. Allenby recognized their worth and believed that they could play a significant role in his plan to finally defeat von Sander's forces in Palestine. The Arabs would assist the main attack by disrupting von Sander's railway communication, especially around the vital junction at Deraa. Lawrence and the Arabs operated from bases deep in the desert. From there, they would strike at the railways using speed and surprise. But the Desert Mounted Corps remained Allenby's main weapon. They would exploit the breakthrough and prevent the escape of Turkish rolling stock by cutting the northern railway lines as quickly as possible. As for Allenby's deception plan, it included maintaining camps of empty tents and dummy horse lines so that the Desert Mounted Corps appeared at camp. All movement to the east was carried out by day in full view of the Turks. Movement to the west took place at night. To deceive von Sanders, the training pattern remained unchanged, but rumors were spread of concentrations of troops around Jerusalem. Allenby and his staff worked tirelessly to ensure that every part of his elaborate plan was put in place. This included the laying of miles of cable, vital for communications between Allenby and his subordinate headquarters. But some of the cables were dummies and part of the deception plan. Across the desert sands, Liman von Sander's front line ran from Amman in the east, then across the coastal plain to a point just north of Jaffa. Some qualified Turkish troops were sent to reinforce him, but his manpower and resupply problems were continually exacerbated by poor support from his superiors. Liman von Sanders also suffered from insufficient mobile reserves. He hoped to identify Allenby's main attack in time to deploy reserves to block it. He also believed that the experience he had gained in defending Gallipoli would help him. Once the last German offensive on the Western Front had been driven back by the Allies at the end of July 1918, von Sanders knew that it was only a matter of time before Allenby attacked. But not until September 17th did von Sanders finally receive firm intelligence on Allenby's offensive. An Indian deserter from the Egyptian Expeditionary Force told the Turkish High Command that a major British assault would be launched in 2 days, with the main attack falling on von Sanders' right flank. Mustafa Kemal, one of the best of the Turkish commanders, believed the defector. Liman von Sanders did not. He was certain that Allenby would use the same tactic that had brought him success at Gaza a year earlier. On the day before the battle, Allenby's guns and infantry moved into their final assembly areas. On the critical left flank, 35,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 383 guns faced a Turkish force of a mere 8,000 infantry and 130 guns. Allenby left just 22,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry to cover the remaining 45 miles. Von Sanders faced him there with 24,000 Turkish infantry and 270 guns. Allenby was confident that his plan would work. Von Sanders, on the other hand, had ignored the available intelligence on where Allenby would strike, an error which would cost him dearly. Allenby had succeeded in piecing together a disparate force. They included the highly professional and tough Indian units. They were the fearsome Gurkhas from the mountains of Nepal who terrorized the Turks with their ruthlessness. Rugged Australians and New Zealanders with little respect for traditional British Army discipline made up a major part of the Desert Mounted Corps. Their role in Palestine was as mounted infantry, fighting on foot, but also using the skills of bushmen and boundary riders when in the saddle. Their horses were the sturdy but fast whalers from New South Wales in Australia, whose endurance matched that of the legendary Russian Cossack pony. As camels could go days without water, Allenby's men made extensive use of them, especially for the transport of supplies. Allenby also had the advantage of the relatively new phenomenon of air power. He had an air force of some 80 aircraft, made up of fighter, reconnaissance, and bomber planes. By September 1918, Allenby's Air Force controlled the skies over Palestine and was determined to prove itself as a new, decisive weapon. Allenby's men nicknamed him the Bull, partly because of his robust physique, but also as a result of his infamous temper. Signals were frequently sent ahead of a visit by Allenby to his units as BL. This was shorthand for Bull Loose. It kept Allenby's troops on their toes and ultimately earned him their respect. Their physical discomforts were compensated in part by the romanticism of fighting in a land that they had only read about in the Bible. In contrast, the Arabs who inhabited Palestine and Arabia had grown increasingly discontented under Turkish rule. They felt that they had been dispossessed from land that they believed was rightfully theirs. Apart from wanting to drive their Turkish opponents from it, they also hoped that their part in Allenby's victory would be rewarded by Allied recognition of a new Arab independent state in the Middle East. In contrast to Allenby's men, the Turkish troops were becoming increasingly disillusioned. They felt that their senior commanders were losing interest in their welfare, evident in their worsening supply situation. Standards of military training had also declined, and the younger soldiers lacked confidence. The troops were also unsettled by political discontent at home. They blamed the Sultan and his advisors for Turkey's rapidly declining fortunes. Their frustration led to atrocities in Palestine against a disgruntled Arab population. Liman von Sanders worked tirelessly to improve the situation of the Turkish soldier, but he was hindered by the lack of administrative support, blaming his superior, the snobbish Hans von Seck. The men under his new command were being expected to make do with second-rate weapons and equipment. They were also being subjected to rumors from home that their political and military leaders were losing interest in Palestine and that they were being abandoned to their fate. Worse, disease incapacitated many of von Sanders' men. Some were already resigned to losing and were giving themselves up to British troops. But whatever the failings of their organization, the individual Turkish soldier was respected by the Allied troops. They called him Johnny Turk, a term of affection and respect. Noting the decline in Turkish morale, Arab hostility towards them became increasingly open. Liman von Sanders did have German troops with him. These formed the German Asia Corps and had a strength of 3,000 cavalry and 32,000 infantry. Compared to their Turkish counterparts, they were well trained and equipped. Liman von Sanders relied heavily on his fellow Germans, but there were not enough of them. Despite their many problems, von Sanders' forces were determined to hold their positions and make Allenby's men pay dearly for any ground gained. As darkness fell on Wednesday, September 18, 1918, Allenby's troops completed their final deployments. They knew that the decisive moment in the Palestine campaign against the Turks had arrived. Edmund Allenby and Liman von Sanders were about to face each other in what would be the critical moment in their lives. Soon after midnight on Thursday, September 19, 1918, the plains of Megiddo in Palestine erupted with an intense artillery bombardment. It marked the opening of Allenby's long-awaited attack on the Turkish-German forces of Liman von Sanders. As daylight appeared at 4:30 a.m., a combined British, Australian, New Zealand, and Indian force struck, led by Allenby's cavalry. The first waves were followed by a further concentrated mass of cavalry. British aircraft swarmed above. The bombardment continued across the center and left flank of the Turkish defenses, tying down von Sanders' troops. On his right flank, the surprised Turks fought desperately. As his artillery, infantry, and cavalry moved forward, Allenby realized that his elaborate deception plan had worked. The field artillery was soon pounding away from new positions to support the gathering momentum of the attack. Allenby was already breaking through the Turkish lines. Now the Air Force were ready for their turn. Wave after wave of aircraft took off from desert airfields to attack von Sander's communications, supply dumps, and troop concentrations. For 2 hours on the first morning of the battle, the Royal Air Force and Royal Australian Air Force created havoc in the Turkish rear areas. Enjoying total air supremacy, Allenby's aircraft swooped menacingly above the battlefield. They completely frustrated von Sander's efforts to deploy reserves to shore up his crumbling right wing. The shock of this assault totally numbed the defenders. By the end of the day, as his guns continued to thunder, Allenby's troops had captured the town of Megiddo. Within 24 hours, the Turkish 8th Army was nearly decimated as Allenby's attack opened up a massive gap on the Turkish right. Over 7,000 Turkish troops and 100 guns were captured. Liman von Sanders was also losing control of his other forces. Mustafa Kemal's 7th Army, fearing it would be outflanked, fell back 25 miles. Near the River Jordan, it became enmeshed with the troops of the 4th Army, who were also making a rapid withdrawal. The situation became chaotic. The number of prisoners increased by the hour. Desperately, von Sanders tried to regain control of his subordinate commanders, not recognizing the growing momentum of Allenby's advance. Early on September 20th, cavalry of the Desert Mounted Corps entered Nazareth, Liman von Sanders' headquarters. He narrowly escaped, having been spirited away by his staff. The Desert Mounted Corps then pressed on northward, creating further confusion among the fleeing Turkish forces. Allenby was determined to deny Liman von Sanders an opportunity to restore his troops. Prince Faisal and his Arabs were also playing their part in the destruction of the Turkish armies. T.E. Lawrence rendered the vital Turkish railway routes unusable. The ground assault was being closely coordinated with the air offensive. The Turkish retreat was rapidly developing into a rout. Von Sanders' unfortunate troops were constantly harassed from the air, and the retreating columns were cut to pieces. In one incident, an entire supply column was caught in a narrow valley, giving the Turkish troops no hope of escape. One Australian officer noted, "Pilot after pilot, flying in perfect order, dropped his bombs and then raked the poor Turks with machine gun fire. Everywhere they were mercilessly pursued and caught in the unfolding slaughter." Few Turkish soldiers survived such attacks. Liman von Sanders was now desperate to restore order out of the chaos and halt Allenby's advance. Allenby's relentless pursuit of Liman von Sanders' Turkish and German forces appeared unstoppable. Von Sanders himself was desperately trying to regain control of his disintegrating armies. Allenby, on the other hand, had no intention of losing his advantage. When told that the Desert Mounted Corps had taken 10,000 prisoners, he replied, "That's no bloody good to me. I want 30,000 before you are done." His wish was granted. On September 25th, the Australian and New Zealand mounted troops crossed the River Jordan, their objective Amman, present-day capital of Jordan. The attack was preceded by a short but intense bombardment. 2,750 cavalry took part in the attack. They took 2,500 shocked and demoralized Turkish prisoners. An angry captured German officer said, "We tried to cover the Turks' retreat, but we expected them to also do something, even if only to keep their heads. This they failed to do." By the end of September, Allenby's men had advanced over 85 miles and were heading for Damascus. Lawrence and his Arabs were also closing in on the city, and a race began between the two forces to win the prize of taking Damascus. Lawrence got there first, entering the city on October 1st. The next day, Indian cavalry of the Desert Mounted Corps arrived, and Damascus was officially declared to be in Allied hands. Prince Faisal and his Arabs, believing the dawn of independence had arrived, attempted to set up the basis of their long-held dream of an independent Arab state. But Allenby was not prepared to involve himself in political matters. His only concern was to continue his pursuit of the now shattered Turkish armies. He therefore urged his Arabs to push on northwards with his own troops. The advance continued. Some units of the Desert Mounted Corps rode on camels, which proved their superior staying power to the horse. On October 16th, Allenby's troops took Homs. The Turks hurriedly retreated northwards. The Allied advance continued towards Aleppo. Occasionally, Turkish rearguards turned on the advancing British, but to no avail. By October 25th, Allenby's cavalry were on the outskirts of Aleppo. They were briefly checked by Mustafa Kemal. But by the evening, Kemal's troops were withdrawing. The following day, British armored cars moved in for the kill, crossing the surrounding desert and hills. The armored cars brushed aside the remaining opposition, and Allenby's troops entered Aleppo that evening. Those Turkish troops who were captured by the Arabs could not expect mercy. Catching them in the craggy hills around Aleppo, the Arabs took revenge for hundreds of years of repression, killing the Turks rather than taking them prisoner. The game was up for Liman von Sanders and his Turkish troops. The last vestige of the Ottoman Empire crumbled. On October 31st, the armistice was signed. The war in the Middle East was finally over. The Megiddo offensive had broken, then destroyed the Turkish army in Palestine. Not only had the cost been high for Liman von Sanders and his troops, but it also brought about Turkey's final defeat and the end of the Ottoman Empire. For Alinbi, it was a triumph. In 38 days, his force had advanced more than 350 miles, taken over 75,000 Turkish and 4,000 German prisoners, and captured 400 guns. Alinbi's bold plan had been brilliantly executed by tough, determined, and well-led troops. Above all, the Megiddo campaign would go down in history as the last great cavalry victory. The advent of the internal combustion engine on the battlefield diminished the days of horse cavalry. After Megiddo, General Sir Edmund Allenby's reputation rose among his troops and the people of Palestine. The Arabs believed that Allenby had fulfilled an ancient prophecy that a warrior would deliver them from Ottoman rule. They nicknamed Allenby Al-Nabi, the prophet. He was promoted to Field Marshal and elevated to the peerage as Viscount Alinbi of Megiddo. After the war, Alinbi served as High Commissioner for Egypt. He died in 1936. His Megiddo campaign remains a textbook example for military commanders today. General Otto Liman von Sanders saw his career end with the signing of the armistice. He lived quietly after the war and wrote a book, 5 Years in Turkey. It was published shortly before his death in 1929. Liman von Sanders' masters, like General Hans von Seeckt, had not repaid the debt of loyalty and service that they owed him for maintaining the Turkish army against all the odds. As it was, von Sanders labored under severe disadvantages. His lines of communication were under constant threat from T.E. Lawrence and Prince Faisal's Arabs. Simultaneously, von Sanders faced the overwhelming strength of Allenby's forces. As a result, the battle between Allenby and Liman von Sanders proved to be one of the most unequal contests in modern warfare.